Hi, thanks for being with us. This is the inaugural, the very first, the premiere edition of the Power Hungry podcast, where we talk about energy, power, innovation. And because we're talking about energy, power, and innovation, we're going to talk some about politics as well. I'm Robert Bryce. I'm super happy to finally be launching this podcast. And I'm even more happy that my first guest is my friend and colleague, Tyson Culver. Tyson directed the new film that we just released. In fact, it just came out on June 2nd. It's called Juice: How Electricity Explains the World. And so, thought given that I have just made a documentary, I was the producer, Tyson was the director, that we'd talk about the film. So, Tyson, welcome. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me on your inaugural Power Hungry podcast.
The
Excited to be
premiere,
here.
the first.
Premiere, yes, exactly. I'm glad to first to touch ground. Yeah, excited to talk about the film. Let's have at it. Ask
Sure.
away. We could talk about all the stuff we've covered multiple times in various places. Let's get after
Sure.
it.
Sure. So, well, one of the things that just comes to mind, we've had a pandemic. We are seeing demonstrations in the streets, widespread demonstrations. And one of the things I'm thinking, well, why is this film relevant now? What is it about today that makes this film relevant? What's your view?
I think it hits on a couple different factors. We'll tackle the easier one first, the pandemic side. I never thought I would say a pandemic is easy, but as it relates to the pandemic, and we made a film about electricity and all the things that that are being used to combat this pandemic rely on electricity. Whether it's the hospitals, whether it's the boredom, you're stuck at home and you're watching Netflix and you have your AC running because it's the middle of the summer in Texas. There are so many different ways that electricity touches our lives, and the way we have it here in the states is in stark contrast to the way the folks outside of the U.S. and developing countries have it, especially given the current climate of there being a pandemic going on. Um, in terms of the all of the issues we're seeing with regards to race relations in the U.S. and systemic racism. I thought about this the other day. There's Our film's about inequality. It's poverty, women's rights, and climate change, and it's really talking about energy poverty and energy inequality. And while I would never say that inequality and systemic racism are the same thing, I would say that they're cousins. They are related. The air that gives them breath is apathy. We don't seem to really care about what's going on in the rest of the world when it comes to energy poverty because we got it so good. And a lot of us that are of privilege and white, there could be a strong case to be made that we're not really thinking about what's happening to our fellow humans, our fellow brothers and sisters that don't look like us, that don't sound like us. So I think that like I said, I could never equate racism and inequality. They're not quite the same thing, but there are parallels, I think, between what's going on today and some of the stuff that we cover in our film.
I'd put it slightly differently. Not to disagree with any of the points you made, but what I see is the one of the key issues that's being at issue here is, yes, it's about racial issues, but I think there's also and that inevitably is about class,
Hmm.
and I think that that's one of the key issues that is related directly to energy and energy availability is the issue of class and what
Hmm.
class are you? Can you afford all the energy you need? And as we saw in the film, uh, we went all over the world, and particularly in India, Lebanon, Puerto Rico, people could not afford the energy that they needed, and they
Hmm.
or some cases just simply wasn't available. So let's what let's talk about more specifically about the film itself. So, what was your favorite interview? I know we interviewed 50 different people over what a 5 year period when we first started talking about this. There are a lot
The
of times, a lot of instances, a lot of moments that stand out for me. But my experience was I wasn't working with a lot of the gear, and you were handling the camera gear and everything else, but you were there for all of them. So what did you of all the people and moments, what stands out for you now looking back?
Um, I thought about this because we talked about this the other day. I think there are two that stand out. The first would be Priscilla Atanza, and we covered her pre-funding out of the Breakthrough Dialogue with a host of other interviews. But I really she just jumped off the screen. She was full of life, but I mean, she knew everything we wanted to discuss, and her answers were just spectacular. I mean, she became a constant thread throughout the course of the film. Um, and the way she talked about what the absence of electricity means for women and girls in developing countries was just, I mean, it's stuff you and I discussed prior to the interview, but to hear it from someone from Ghana when she brought in like her family members,
And
that didn't
the
grow up
story
quite as
that right, and the story she told about trying to do her math lesson, right? She
yeah,
was having
in the
her
blackout, yeah.
multiplication tables, and she was, I'll just add to what you're saying about her because she was, and I think she's in graduate school now back here in the US. She was at the Center for Global Development, but she was one of those people of the many interviews we did. She spoke not just in complete sentences, but in full paragraphs. We're perfectly
Yeah.
punctuated. I mean, it was just amazing because we'd finish one segment and we'd look at each other like, yeah, that was perfect. That was great.
Yeah,
Let's keep going.
yeah, it makes it easy, but also difficult in the editing room because her answers were so perfect. I mean, we could have done 30 minutes just with Priscilla. The other interview I liked a lot, and it's weird. I mean, there were so many. Hussein Moser, we'll talk about him, but it was towards the end actually when we interviewed Jessica Lovering, um, and I think the reason that I liked it so much was I still hadn't fully come around to all the stuff on nuclear, and whether or not I agreed with some of your points and other points I'd read. I hadn't got there yet, and I was like, well, then explain to me why. Explain to me someone that definitely came into the film not thinking that that nuclear was the answer or this a big answer. Explain to me why it has such a bad rap. And she went through this whole thing about renewables sound good because they're like your grandmother's energy, and I mean nuclear, I mean it came from the industrial military complex, and I mean it was just like she stated all the things that if you think about it are already there, but I just hadn't considered them, and it made it became a tool that we could then use in the film to explain why the audience member might have a preconceived notion about nuclear. And so that was critical because we needed that in order to get the film to where it would have
Right.
an ending that made sense,
Yeah.
and that
He
covered
really
all the
gave us
points.
he really gave us that context
Mhm,
for the history of nuclear opposition and also that context for why renewables are so popular, right? And
totally.
so, yeah, and she had that great dress on with the little elephants on it.
Hmm.
Remember that?
Hmm.
That was great.
Which my
And
wife loved because my wife loves elephants. We have elephants everywhere in my house. So yes, totally.
and the film is produced by Electric Elephant Films,
Mhm,
the
mhm,
company that we formed to do the project. Yeah, she was great, and to be able to do it in New York at a
mhm.
time when we were filming at the Indian Point Energy Center made it even kind of more perfect in terms of the timing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we could go on and on talking about so many different interviews that I enjoyed. I think we talked about Hussein Mosul, the gentleman that picked us up in the cab, when we got into Beirut, within 10 minutes of our taxi drive, you're just riffing with him, asking him questions about the landscape of energy and electricity in Lebanon. And I'm just, snapping pictures away, looking at military and stuff. And
That's
hey,
right.
is it
Yeah.
okay if I put this camera at you? And that's that. Like I said before, that's the most honest interview we did because it was just, oh, great, we got this moment, and he was cool with it.
It was on the fly, and you had your Sony SLR there in
Mhm.
the well, not what do you call them? Not SLRs anymore. What is that?
A mirrorless A7S2. Thank you, Sony.
Right,
Plug.
yes, thank you, Tony. Yeah, but it was, you had that camera, very small camera that we could do those kinds of interviews. We
Hmm.
didn't mic him up. We didn't cue him. We
Nope.
didn't, it was no more, just to make that story clear. So we landed at Rafik Hariri Airport in Beirut, and there were four of us. It was you and me and John Moody and Matt Wallace. And all some four pretty big American guys, and we have a ton of stuff. I mean, all of our cases and our luggage and the rest, and we loaded into the van. And you're right, we hadn't left the airport in more than 5, maybe 10 minutes. And I'd done some homework on Lebanon, and I knew the things that I wanted to look at. But I did. I said, tell me, what do you know about the generator mafia? And he's like, I'll tell you anything you want to know. And then that was when
Hmm.
you said, do you mind if we record this? And it
Oh
was,
yeah,
it was
go ahead. Yeah.
and I'll shout out to my friend Jimmy Nassour, who is here in Austin. He and I were on the board at Parkside Community School for many years, and 3 or 4 years ago, I said, "Jimmy, I'm thinking about going to Beirut." He says, "Oh, well," and his family is Lebanese, and he's been in the U.S. his whole life. His dad was born here, but he said, "If you go over there, I'll go with you." And I said, "Oh, come on, just give me a name." No, he and Simone Najim, his brother-in-law,
Hmm.
met us in Beirut. They showed us all around, and I bring this up one because I have great admiration, great friendship with Jimmy. But he said before we left, he said, "Listen, when we get over there, people are very willing to talk about politics." And he said, from the shoe shine kid on the corner to the taxi driver, they know all about politics and they'll talk about it. And it was proven before we even got to the hotel.
It
Wow.
was.
And Hussein Mosul, who had spent a lot of time in the US in Dearborn in Michigan, and
Hmm.
everything he said turned out to be true. And it was exactly as Jimmy told me before
Yep.
we even left, that
Yeah.
everyone knows the deal. And he knew the deal. And you're right. It was just a tremendous, and we were lucky to run into him later, remember, because we didn't get a release from him when we
Oh
first
yeah.
did the interview. And I had to find him
Yeah.
again because I was like, hey man, we really want to use that
That was
interview.
good stuff.
It
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
great. That was
Yeah.
great stuff. Okay, so yes, agreed. The interview. I'll say quickly. One of my favorite interviews was. I just thought Puerto Rico was amazing. Just the entire experience in
Mhm.
Puerto Rico. Um, and Aide Torres, Luis Gonzalez's mother, was one of these kind of little bits of kismet that we were even able to meet this woman who lived up in the hills in the rural area near Humacao, Puerto Rico. She was charming, but Edith Ortiz was the other interview that I just thought was really remarkable because, she was a young woman, pretty, had three young kids, and reminded me, and I think probably you have three children as well. Well, this could be us, and living in a house in and without grid power for 7 months. And
Mhm.
to have her say, "Yeah, I feel like I'm living in the time of my grandmother, that we've gone back in time." And it was just really at a very she was just had this beautiful poise about her that I thought was just remarkable.
Yeah, and Puerto Rico was the last major trip that we did too, and I know we kind of went back and forth on it even, and we had stories from India and we had stories from all over really, but we did. It's the apathy thing we talked about earlier. How do we make it matter to folks in the West? I think it's so important that we did that, not just to tell the story because it's a story that it got some coverage, but not near as much as it should have gotten in the news, I think. But also, I think it's somewhat grounding for folks that are going to watch it in the States because, oh, well, that's happening in India or Africa, well, or, wherever. And for here, it was, well, this is happening to, United States citizens. And it's,
On American soil.
American soil, and they are essentially relegated to living in a third world country. They have no power. Many folks didn't have any water because it's so hilly, and the water can go uphill without electricity. So, yeah, I the interview we did with the majority senator in San Juan,
Josiana Balturas. Yeah.
that was that was something special. It was also, I mean, I don't, I not special in the sense that the power went out. The second major blackout hit when we were having that interview. I mean, and as a director, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's verite, in its truest form. And you just kind of, and it was interesting too, because you're bilingual, but the Spanish is a little bit more difficult in Puerto Rico, and so I remember you would ask him a question in Spanish, he would answer in English, you'd ask him a question in English, he would answer in Spanish, and then you finally found this, this kind of momentum, and then suddenly, poof, and the lights
Right.
just went out, and the UPS starts going on, and it's like, oh, let's pull out the batteries, and we just rolled with it. And
Yeah.
that's in the movie. And I think it's awesome that viewers get to experience what we experienced when we went there, to
That's a
some degree.
yeah, that's a great point. And I didn't, I was flustered at the moment because I'm trying to, deal with the Spanish translation. I mean, his English was about the level of my Spanish, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so when you say I'm bilingual, I remember when Jim Hightower had a slander for some politician a while back who was claimed that he could speak Spanish, and Hightower said, "Well, he's bi ignorant." Apropos
I
of
would never
nothing
call
but
you by ignorant, Robert.
thank you very kindly.
Yeah.
So, my tourist level Spanish wasn't up to the task, but thankfully we had Gustavo Rodriguez who was there and able to help us with the translation. But throughout Puerto Rico, the number of people who are really went out of their way to help us
Hmm.
in terms of what, you know, the making of the film to me was the joyful part, right? The doing those interviews and getting to, as I'm talking to these people, knowing that I can take those little bitty segments that we're
Hmm.
talking and things that allow them to become human to the people I want to see the film. That to me was really the great joy in the making of the film. That's a prelude to the one of the questions I wanted to just bring up about the hardest part, because I mean, to me, the joy was in the making. The hard part was in the distributing, right, and dealing
Yeah.
with the business side of the film business, which I knew nothing about. And frankly, had I understood how hard it was going to be, I might have taken another thought about it. But I was familiar with the book business. So that, well, the movie, how hard can this be? And it was a lot harder than I thought.
Like, yeah, and it's interesting too, because so I come from the commercial world. Juice was that was my directorial debut, right? And I'd worked on independent features in the past, but in the commercial and branded content world, you make it and it's out there. You make it and it's out there. And that wasn't quite the case with Juice. We did have a spectacular team. Matt Wallace, an Emmy winner from Disgrace, John Moody, multiple Emmy winners, including Deadliest Catch. We had a score from Silas Height, another Emmy winner. We discovered, James Treacle along the way, who had been cutting all kinds of stuff for our company, and brought him on, and he cut an amazing film, and did such an amazing job, was such an integral part of the story. We tagged him with a co-producing credit, so we had this amazing team in place, and it was a small footprint, and that was helpful because it allowed us to get some of those more intimate stories that maybe we may not have otherwise been able to do so had we had 15 or 20 people on set. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The distribution part of it was a mother, and it's one of those things that we learned along the way, right? There's so much that we learned after the film was done,
Right.
when it came to getting a sales agent and making sure that people saw the film. And, I remember, seeing our trailer out there and looking at our trailer versus others and our film and others and thinking, what? Why aren't we out there just yet? And then thankfully, eventually landing with Gravitas. And what's spectacular about Gravitas is when they say they're going to put the movie everywhere, they put it everywhere. I mean, it drops on iTunes and Amazon, and it hits Vimeo and Vudu and Google Play, and it's on Comcast On Demand, and it's on all these different things, because that's the part I think that was so disheartening after we wrapped what looks and sounds and feels. And I mean, it was mixed by the dude that did Alita, Brad Engelking. It was posted by the TBD Post here in Austin, who are amazing, do all kinds of films. So we had this great product, but it wasn't out. And so having our film take that next step and get out there was just like, oh,
Yeah.
yes, now folks can see it. And I mean, and you know, it's hard not to get a little worried along the way. And did this thing really look as good as I think it did? Did we make all the points I think we made? And then I mean, you go to the review section on our site, and heck yeah, man, we got 20 plus reviews from all kinds of folks just talking about how much they enjoyed it, and how we've talked about it before, how you lean right and I lean left, and we tried not to make it about a tribal like typical energy stories are, and instead focus on what's the story. Let's ask people questions, and let's listen, and weave a story out of their answers. And that's I'm excited, and I'm thrilled with the response we've seen so far.
I am too. I mean, that's been the part that's made me forget about the hard parts. And that one of the, dealing with the distribution and getting that figured out.
Mhm.
And also just knowing, who could we really trust? And, I've
Yeah.
heard stories about the movie business and how hard it is and the rest of it, but I had to experience it myself. I just thought, oh, well, we'll figure out the distribution later. Which maybe in hindsight, of course, is easy to see your mistake, but now getting some of the positive feedback has been really rewarding for me. So, we kind of jumped to the end there, but so those we had several false starts though, right? We thought, oh well, we'll start with my refrigerator and we'll build a story around the refrigerator, but it really
Oh, yeah.
wasn't really until we went to India. And this is another person that I want to acknowledge is Joy Shree Roy, who we met through the Breakthrough Institute, and she facilitated our entire visit to India, which
Mhm.
it sounds trite, but it was life changing for me because it really brought home from the very beginning of the project the depth of energy poverty and the depth of electricity poverty that still exists for one of the world's most populous countries, where you have 300 million people with no access to electricity, and where the average Indian uses less electricity than my refrigerator. So it's a long kind of rambling intro, but that the experience I had, and I think for you in India, was just truly extraordinary.
It was. I mean, it absolutely was. And you're right. When we started, and there were even times during the course of production where it felt like we might make this the film about numbers, because the statistics are just, I mean, they do tell a good story. I mean, it's how you sold me on it when we had, tacos at Maria's Taco Express,
It's so
5 years
cool, and
ago.
it's not human, and that was what
Yeah.
I think we were able to
Yeah.
see in India. We had to tell people stories.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, but I still remember I met with you, and I immediately, like, immediately after I left that lunch, I called up Wallace. I was like, "Hey, you gotta hear this." And I laid out what you laid out, to me, the average legal weed dispensary has a power density similar to that of, a data center for Amazon or Google, and then we talked about, women and girls, and we talked about 1 billion people without electricity and 2 billion more who use less electricity than a typical American refrigerator. And I had in my head at the time, and I'm sure Wallace did as well, was this giant infographic, all these numbers. But I don't know that there's ever really been a Guinness Book of World Records movie, because that'd fall kind of flat, And here's another stat.
Right.
And I think when we took that first international trip and went to India, it was absolutely life changing, because it's impossible to witness that level of energy poverty, and see how people's lives are impacted and not come away a changed person, and we were lucky. We had someone like Joyce Roy that, I mean, I got there 3 days before you did, and I didn't know what I didn't know. I just bought an FS7, and I mean, I've shot for years, but I mean, I wouldn't qualify. I wouldn't say I'm a DP and I'm gonna go out and shoot a bunch of stuff. And the footage in India is some of my favorite footage from the entire film. And so I
Sure.
just like let it roll the whole darn time. And I mean, it was just awesome, and it was critical, I think, to how the rest of the story drew out from there.
Yeah.
Because that interview with Rahina was just so touching.
And you're referencing Rehenna Jamadar, who we met in this tiny village called Majlishpur. And Joya Shri arranged for us to go there because one of her students, doctoral students, that was doing her work on this little village on energy availability, how much electricity do they use, how much LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, do they use, and that was where we found, I think, the heart of the film was in
Hmm.
that interview with Rohena Jamadar, who's this gracious woman that we met in this tiny little agricultural village about an hour southeast of Kolkata. Um, and I remember that, I remember it my whole life, just asking her about her life. And she had lived for 30, she was 44. She had her first child when she was 14.
Hmm.
And one of her daughters was in university. And I said, well, would you have gone to university if you'd had lights in your house when you were a child? And because one of her daughters was going to the university in Kolkata, and she was clearly proud of it, said, if you'd had electricity in your house when you were growing up, would you have gone to university? And she remember he nodded her head to the right, like,
Yeah.
the Bengalis do. And she
Yeah.
said, yes, I would have gone.
Yeah.
And I didn't. sometimes it takes a while to absorb things and understand what you've seen and what you've heard. And it was a couple days later when I came up with that line that darkness kills human potential and electricity nourishes it. And she knew, you could tell by the look on her
Hmm.
face, she knew that was an opportunity that had passed her by.
Hmm.
And, you know, she's only one woman among hundreds of millions who are living in similar situations.
Well, and Joy Tree touched on that a little bit in her interview with her because, one, she had that amazing line, you educate the woman, you educate the household. But she also talked about all of the lost opportunity for humanity. How many
Yeah.
women and girls first, and then how many just, folks in general that are suffering through energy poverty? How many Einsteins have we missed out on? How many brilliant minds that could have cured disease, could have invented who knows what. How many amazing things have we missed out on over the course of our lifetimes and countless lifetimes before it because of not countless, but several lifetimes before us because of just, the geography of where someone is born and what that means, especially to women and girls, because they're the ones gathering the dung, gathering the firewood, gathering the fuel essentially to light the fire, to cook over, and they're spending all day inside the house essentially living lives of indentured servitude as opposed to being educated and having their dreams dashed before they ever really get a chance to have their dreams begin. It's this is the life they live, and it's not changing because of where they are and how the absence of electricity has put them in that position.
Yeah. Well, and it was also the same story we saw with Edith Ortiz and her three girls, right?
Hmm.
That for 7 months, they weren't able to do their schoolwork to the best of their ability because they didn't have electricity. They didn't have internet access. They didn't have enough computer time at home. So that the global nature of the problem and the reach of this inequality in terms of what we take for granted was really striking. And then to go from that level of poverty in India, where people commonly steal electricity, to then come to another part of the United States and see a place where the electricity is in short supply as well. I mean, that changed my frame of reference as well, because I think the frankly part of the Puerto Rico shortage, the part of Puerto Rico problem is there's some racist attitude there as well, right? I mean, this is a Spanish speaking island. It's a
Hmm.
colony of the United States still, has never been made a state.
They don't have
The
voting rights.
racial
I mean,
aspect. Yeah,
yeah. I mean,
yeah,
absolutely, and it also, I don't want to get too far off point because I like where you're going
sure.
with that. But there was something when you talk about the absence of electricity and how they were dealing with kids not being able to be educated. A great parallel to that story is, okay, bring it back to the current day, and we're dealing with a pandemic, and we have three kids here at my house, and two, 6, and 13, and the while while it has not been pleasant to be stuck inside all this time with them, we're also having an opportunity to kind of reconnect as a family. But we also have all these amazing opportunities at our disposal. Here in Austin, AIST did a great job of figuring out, okay, well, we're going to work with Zoom and we're going to work with all these different, mechanisms to ensure that our kids are still getting educated, and maybe they're not in the classroom, and maybe they're not getting the same level of attention that they might have gotten. But in other cases, maybe they're even getting more opportunities because, oh, well, this one's a little more advanced and we
Sure.
can put her on other subjects. Once again, using electricity, using all the tools that we have at our disposal in our home. And I think of the luxury that we have here versus, places in Puerto Rico where they don't have that accessibility and they weren't able to plug back in, and that extends into places that are impoverished neighborhoods here in America too. I mean,
Sure.
the privileged few are quite privileged. We're really, really lucky with what we have, and a lot of that ties back to access to electricity and our capacity, to pay for it and be able to take care of our family. And it's just it's disheartening.
Sure. Well, and one point that when we talked about adding this to the film, but we didn't. We were able to talk about cannabis, right? And we talked
Hmm.
about Bitcoin mining. We didn't
Yeah,
talk about the high tech or the big tech companies and the
yeah,
amount of electricity they consume. So, you're talking about, Zoom and we shop on Amazon. We use Amazon Prime. We get, Netflix, iTunes, all of these things. We only think about the electricity that we are getting from the wall plug, but all of those companies, and it's a point that I make in my book. Oh, hey,
oh, there it is.
did I mention, did I mention A Question of Power?
Gotta have your
Uh,
props close by, man.
Electricity and the Wealth of Nations. Did I mention the book? I write in the book about the technology companies, Google, or Alphabet, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple, and how much electricity they consume, which is on the order of 30 or more terawatt hours a year. I mean, this is as much as Denmark. I mean, these are
Mm,
enormous numbers, right? So that electricity wealth that you're talking about in your house is only part of the electricity wealth of the society that we live in,
yeah.
right? And so there's this offsite consumption that we don't even consider, but when we use our cell phones or any of these other devices that we rely on, we're relying on a massive electricity infrastructure that we don't even see or ever think about, that is also part of the wealth of the nation.
Hmm. Yeah, there was a term I remember you used, but that we didn't touch on in the film also about invisible infrastructure. All the power lines that are just there, all the utility companies that are just there, all the dams. I mean, there's so much that powers our quite prosperous lives here in the states that we just don't even think about.
That's right, and it was one of our disagreements. I said, "Hey, man, let's shoot some transformers and some power lines." And you're like, "Great, yeah, no."
Yes, I
But
remember.
it's I know, but it was one of those things where we do see them, and we see these
Yeah.
telephone poles, we see or the power poles, we see the power lines, we don't think about it. We don't it's
Hmm.
that infrastructure that is absolutely essential to our lives, and yet we almost we just don't see it. It's just become invisible to our somehow to our collective understanding, right? Well, of course it's there, and of course it works. Well, no, not of course. And that was what we
Yeah.
saw in Lebanon, where that lack of integrity. And I thought about that for a long time. What's that right word? System has to have integrity, and
Hmm.
Lebanon is still in now in dire straits. Iraq is in dire straits because the systems, the political systems in those countries are very weak, and without strong governance, without strong civil society, electric grids just don't work. And that was what we clearly saw in Lebanon. And one of the parts that maybe the more uncomfortable parts of all the travel we did was shooting the generator mafia in Beirut and getting chased off by some really big dudes who did not want us there.
Yeah, I mean, our crew, though our crew is small, none of us are dinky. I'm 6'1", but Wallace and Moody are both 6'4", and so I wasn't really worried about anything. And so I remember we were driving through, that one, we were just in the middle of Beirut. I believe it's a Beirut, wasn't it? Yeah, we were in the middle of Beirut,
Yeah.
driving along, and I'm like, "Phew, there's a generator. Let's get a shot of it. Really here? Yeah." And then we're talking to the taxi driver, and he's like, "Okay." He pulls over, and we hop out, and I think I had a Steadicam, and Moody just pulled out his red, and we start shooting. And I saw this guy kind of looking over, and then they whistled, and then they like, "Hey, you come here," and we're like, "No, I'm not going to do that." And I remember getting in the car and being chastised by Wallace and the taxi drivers. You can't do that. You can't just get out. I mean, you got to get going. I'm like, "What are you talking about? We came half world away. We're going to get these shots." They're like, "You
Right.
didn't see the size of the guys," because I didn't. I didn't see
Yeah.
those large men coming after us, thankfully. So I was, really, really brave because I didn't know how stupid I had just been.
Well, it was stupid, but it was also part of the story, and I was
Yeah.
desperate. I wanted to get that shot too. I
Yeah.
mean, if we're going to see the generator mafia, we have to see the generators,
Yeah.
and this was an area of Beirut that was notorious for being controlled by the generator mafia. Which, in brief, in Beirut, the electric grid goes dark every day in Beirut for at least 3 hours, sometimes more. So virtually everyone in Lebanon pays two electric bills, one to EDL, Electricité du Liban, which is the grid operator, and another bill they pay to the generator mafia, who is the neighborhood supplier
Hmm.
that gives them electricity when the grid goes out. So this idea that you would pay two different generators, I mean, it's so foreign to any experience that we have in the United States. That was one of the main reasons I wanted to go to Beirut, because I'd heard about it, and in fact, just a few days before we arrived, there was a murder or a shooting. I think two
Hmm.
people were killed in the
Yeah.
city of Sidon, which wasn't far south of Beirut, and it was a dispute between rival generator mafias. They were, having a turf war over who gets to supply electricity. So this is deadly serious business.
Yeah. I mean, of all the places we went, Beirut may have been my favorite. I mean, I really, really, it was, it's beautiful, for one, and it's beautiful both where it's not beautiful and where it is beautiful. When you see some of the poverty that exists there, but also some of the wealth that exists there. And then, we went outside of Beirut, and we saw that amazing microgrid. But as much as I loved it, when we went from Beirut and we went to Iceland, and leaving Beirut was not sketchy. Like, either AK-47s everywhere. We've got all this gear. How do we make sure they don't take any of our stuff? Are they going to jack with us? We really got to get to Iceland, and then getting landing landing in Iceland and coming off the airplane, like, oh, look at it, there are no men with guns, and so that was pretty amazing. But I really did. I love our trip, to trip to Beirut. I would absolutely go back. But I felt a heck of a lot safer when we got into Iceland.
Yeah. No, I will. I'm not especially interested in going back right now. Beirut's, well,
Maybe
Lebanon's
not now. Yeah.
back into crisis again, but we could also see they had an influx of what, 2 million Syrian
Oh
refugees. I
yeah.
mean, it was
Right.
Lebanon has been unstable for a very long time, but it's especially unstable now. And you had the
Right.
areas in the city where Hezbollah was in control, and the people who lived in that part of the city didn't pay any electric bills. So this was part of the kind of the uneasy alliance among the Christians, the Sunni and the Shia in
Hmm.
Lebanon, and that's what's allowed the Iranians to have control and a lot of influence there. And in the interviews that we did, pretty much everybody acknowledged all of this political division and said, "Well, this is the way it is." But
Yeah.
it was a fascinating place, and the people were incredibly friendly, and the food was fantastic, and it was marvelous. It was really just a tremendous opportunity to be able to go there. So, just a quick review, because we've been talking now over 30 minutes, and I don't want to wear out our listeners on the very first edition of the podcast. But um, we talked about what sold you initially. So, tell people why they should watch this film. What is your takeaway now? We've talked about branding, we've talked marketing slogans, and now we have a little bit of distance. So, how do you sell the film now?
So we even talked about how you sell the film, right? Like, we nailed down our story. Over a 3-year period, we traveled over 60,000 miles, interviewed 50 people from 7 countries on 5 continents to tell the human story of electricity and why power equals power. And that last part, the human story of electricity and why power equals power, that's the critical component of it. I For me, as someone that entered the story, very much, a proponent of 100% renewable, I saw that as kind of just a natural transition of our energy grid. Not that I know a lot about energy. That's just that I've heard that a lot. You know, I've seen lots of articles talking about how it's feasible. I I think it's important to, one, get outside our comfort zone. I think it's important to challenge ourselves and look at the entire, picture for all kinds of stuff. But in right now we're facing a lot of things. But when it comes to, energy poverty, the line that came to me in Breckenridge was, anyone that's talking about climate change without mentioning energy poverty is just kicking the can down the road. And I 1000% believe that. You have to realize that, you can't just cover the landscape with windmills and solar panels, because people are going to have a problem with it. The whole thing of, do you want to pave the planet to save the planet? Of course you don't want to do that. Of course you don't want to put, you know, all this stuff out there that eventually is going to have to be replaced with other stuff, and that stuff's going to go in a landfill. You know, and
As
it's
you're saying that, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the thing that comes to mind when you're talking about that is the other thing that we learned, which is, and we saw it in India, we saw it in Puerto Rico, we saw it in Lebanon, people are going to do whatever they have to do to get the electricity they need. They're
Hmm.
not going to stay in the dark. And I think
Hmm.
that that is part of this inequality discussion, right? Because we have this idea, oh, well, the rest can just use less. Well, no, 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 no. They're not going to agree to that. Because
No, no.
they're not happy being in the dark. They want what we want. And so that's the I think I asked you for your takeaway. My takeaway is that we have to accept the reality of the situation today, which is that countries all over the world are simply not going to agree to be energy poor. They just won't. And
No.
this was one of the things that Roger Pilkey's idea about the iron law, that people are not, that when it comes to issues of climate change or politics or economic
Hmm.
growth is going to win every time. And
Absolutely.
that's key. And so that's part of, I think, the broader global dynamic now that is playing out. Germany's opening a new coal-fired power plant this summer. So this idea that people are going to do without electricity, no, that's just not, it's not true. And I think the part that, my takeaway is, we're telling the human story of electricity, and that's essential to understand.
Well, I also, we joke about this as well, because I mean, listen, we're not saying, just put up a ton of coal plants or LNG everywhere, because that's the other thing. Pilkey has that great line about, there is no silver bullet, there's silver buckshot. And geography does play a part. What works in one part of the world may not work in another part of the world. And I think you need to be pragmatic about that. But that line about carbon imperialism, you can't just say you can only use these energy sources, because that's what we in the West have deemed are okay. For everyone else,
Right.
and it's that other line about well, don't you want to leave a better world for your grandchildren? I'm like, well, why do my grandchildren today, my grandchildren in the future, why do they matter more than someone else's life, someone else's children, right now?
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
it's like I said, it's, to me, the film, it looks at both sides of it, and it forces people to step back and think, you know what do you truly believe? Do you believe that people should have opportunity, that they should have an opportunity to be educated, to live a better life, to be free, to not live a life of servitude because of geography, because of gender? Do you believe that the climate is changing, and that we need to do things about that? If you believe those things, you have to realize that this is not a black and white discussion. It's a very gray discussion, because there are so many different options on the table, and we really need to consider all of them if we're going to see any kind of real change in the future.
Yeah. Good. And with 3 billion people living in electricity poverty today, I mean, this is the reality. So I think that that's the other part of the film. So let me thank you, Tyson. Thanks for joining in. I'm gonna I'm learning how to use all these tools on StreamYard. I'm just gonna end with this, just a single frame with me. Thanks to all of you for tuning in, listening to the first edition of the Power Hungry podcast. A few things, calls to action, as we call them in the media business. Watch my film, if you and Tyson's film, Juice: How Electricity Explains the World. It's on iTunes, it's on Amazon, it's on other streaming platforms. You can find us on the web at juicethemovie.com. Our Twitter handle is Juice for All, at Juice for All. You can follow us there. We're on Facebook/Juice the Movie. If you want to buy my book, by all means, it's around here somewhere. Here it is: A Question of Power, Electricity, and the Wealth of Nations. I'm super proud of this. It came out in March. I also do the audio book. You can find that at your fine local bookstores, as well as on online. You can look at my website, robertbryce.com. I'm also on Twitter at Power Hungry, PWR Hungry. So thanks to all of you power hungry listeners. I'm Robert Bryce. I'll talk to you again in the next podcast. Thanks again for listening.